The grand ballroom of the Astoria Hotel sparkled with the light of 100 crystal chandeliers. Guests in elegant evening attire moved gracefully among the tables, exchanging polite conversations about their latest successes. The air buzzed with the sound of laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the soft strains of a live orchestra. Daniel Carter stood at the center of it all, radiating charm and authority. His tailored tuxedo and easy smile made him the picture of a successful corporate lawyer hosting yet another flawless charity gala. At his side was Elena, his wife of 10 years, her emerald green gown accentuating her sharp features and quiet elegance. She smiled, greeting guests with a practiced warmth, but inside, she was a volcano waiting to erupt. For weeks, Elena had known. She had found the texts, intimate, unmistakable messages between Daniel and Dr. Vanessa Gray, their family doctor. A woman Elena had trusted, someone who had been in their home countless times. The betrayal stung like nothing she had ever experienced, and tonight, as Daniel charmed the room, she decided the world needed to know the truth. The moment came during Daniel's speech. He stood at the podium, delivering his carefully rehearsed words about generosity and community spirit. The crowd hung on his every word, admiring the man they saw as a paragon of success and decency. Elena moved closer to the stage, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor, drawing attention as she approached. "Daniel," she interrupted, her voice clear and calm, but carrying an edge that silenced the room. Every eye turned to her, and Daniel froze mid-sentence, his confident facade flickering for a brief moment. "Elena," he began with a nervous chuckle, "perhaps we can discuss this later." "No, I think now is the perfect time," she said, her tone cutting through the tension like a blade. Her eyes locked onto his, then shifted pointedly to Vanessa, who was standing near the stage. The doctor stiffened, her face draining of color. Elena turned back to the crowd, addressing them as if delivering a toast. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to take a moment to thank someone very special to our family, Dr. Vanessa Gray. She's been so devoted to Daniel's well-being, always there for him, even at the oddest hours." A ripple of murmurs swept through the guests as the implication became clear. Daniel's face turned ashen, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled for words. Vanessa looked as though she wished the floor would swallow her whole. Elena pressed on, her voice calm, but seething with contempt. "It takes a remarkable woman to not only treat her patients, but also comfort them in such intimate ways." Her gaze burned into Vanessa, who stood frozen in place, exposed under the scrutiny of dozens of shocked onlookers. The silence in the room was deafening. Daniel took a step toward Elena, his hands raised in a futile attempt to regain control. "Elena, let's talk about this privately." "Oh, now you want privacy?" she snapped, her voice rising. "You didn't seem to care about that when you were sneaking around behind my back." The crowd erupted in whispers, a mix of shock and scandalized delight spreading through the room. Guests exchanged wide-eyed glances, and someone's glass slipped from their hand, shattering on the floor. Elena turned on her heel and walked out, leaving Daniel and Vanessa standing in the middle of the wreckage, their carefully constructed lives unraveling before everyone they had sought to impress. The aftermath of Elena's revelation was a storm no one in the room had anticipated. As the doors to the ballroom swung shut behind her, the shocked guests erupted into hushed whispers, speculation brewing like wildfire. Daniel stood frozen, his usually polished demeanor utterly shattered. Vanessa, pale and visibly trembling, instinctively tried to step back into the shadows of the room, but there was nowhere to hide. A prominent donor, an older man with a sharp suit and sharper tongue, broke the silence first. "Well," he muttered loudly, "that wasn't in the program." His comment earned a ripple of uneasy laughter, though most eyes remained glued to Daniel, who seemed unable to meet anyone's gaze. Vanessa finally found her voice, weak and defensive. "This isn't the place for such personal matters," she began, her words faltering under the weight of the attention directed at her. But Daniel cut her off, his voice low but urgent. "Vanessa, just go." He didn't look at her as he spoke, but the edge in his tone made it clear he wasn't asking. Her lips tightened, and she hesitated, but the sea of judgmental eyes forced her into action. Clutching her purse, she quickly weaved through the crowd and disappeared through a side exit. The silence returned, heavier now, until Daniel cleared his throat and attempted to regain control. "I apologize for that unexpected interruption," he said, his voice strained. "Let's focus on why we're here tonight. To raise funds for a good cause." But the damage was done. The carefully curated image of Daniel Carter, the successful lawyer and devoted family man, lay in ruins. Even as he tried to continue his speech, the crowd's attention had shifted. A woman near the back whispered loudly enough for others to hear, "Can you believe it? With the family doctor of all people." The whisper spread like a contagion, and soon enough, the guests were no longer watching Daniel. They were dissecting the scandal. By the time Daniel concluded his speech, the applause was half-hearted at best. He stepped off the stage and moved through the crowd, attempting to salvage what little reputation he could. But conversations turned cold, and smiles became polite but distant. He knew the look, pity and disgust wrapped in the thin veneer of civility. In the parking lot outside, Elena sat in the back of her car, her driver waiting patiently in the front seat. She watched through the tinted glass as Vanessa's car sped away, followed shortly by Daniel stumbling out of the hotel, his phone pressed to his ear. She knew him well enough to guess he was trying to call her, to beg for some semblance of control over the situation. The phone in her purse buzzed incessantly, but Elena ignored it. She stared at the hotel's grand facade for a moment, the laughter and applause of the crowd from earlier, now a distant memory. A faint smile tugged at her lips, a mix of satisfaction and sadness. The storm had broken, and though her world had been upended, she felt a strange sense of freedom. "Home, ma'am?" the driver asked quietly. Elena nodded. "Yes, home." As the car pulled away, leaving the glittering chaos of the Gala behind, she felt the first weight of 10 years lifting from her chest. The night wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of something entirely new. Daniel paced the quiet confines of his office later that night, the echoes of the Gala's humiliation still ringing in his ears. The whiskey glass in his hand trembled slightly as he downed the amber liquid, trying and failing to dull the sting of his wife's public betrayal, or, as he saw it, her revenge. His phone sat on the desk, buzzing intermittently with calls from colleagues, clients, and a handful of friends desperate for details about the scandal. He ignored them all. He hadn't heard from Elena. No texts, no calls, no sign of her returning to the house they once shared. He knew she wouldn't come back tonight. Perhaps she wouldn't come back at all. In the quiet, his thoughts drifted to Vanessa. He had tried to call her after leaving the hotel, but she hadn't answered. It didn't matter. Their affair, already precarious, was finished. The fallout would make sure of that. He wondered how much damage her reputation would take now that their indiscretions were public knowledge. A flash of guilt crossed his mind, but it was fleeting. His career and standing were at risk, and those mattered far more to him. Meanwhile, Elena sat in the living room of her childhood home, a small but beautifully kept house on the outskirts of the city. The dim light of the table lamp cast a soft glow over her as she sipped tea, her mother sitting across from her, knitting silently. "You did what you had to," her mother said finally, breaking the silence. Elena looked up, her expression tired, but resolute. "It wasn't about revenge," she said quietly. "It was about respect. I've put up with his lies and his ego for years. Tonight, I couldn't let him get away with it anymore." Her mother nodded. "Good. Men like Daniel think they're untouchable until someone reminds them they're not." Elena smiled faintly. For the first time in years, she felt as though she'd regained a piece of herself that had been lost in the shadow of Daniel's ambitions. But Daniel wasn't about to let the scandal die without a fight. The next morning, his PR team sprang into action, drafting carefully worded statements about regrettable misunderstandings and an unfortunate lapse in judgment. He hated every word of it, but he knew the only way to salvage his career was to spin the story before Elena could file for divorce, or worse, speak to the press. Elena, however, was one step ahead. She met with a lawyer the same day, armed with evidence of Daniel's infidelity and a clear determination to ensure he couldn't manipulate the narrative. She wanted a clean break, but more than that, she wanted the truth to stay untarnished. Over the following weeks, the scandal continued to ripple through their social circles. Invitations to galas and fundraisers dried up for Daniel, while Elena found herself the unexpected center of admiration. Women she barely knew approached her, praising her courage. Even those who once idolized Daniel began to see him for what he was, a man who had built his life on deception and charm, only to have it all unravel in a single night. By the time the divorce papers were signed, Daniel's public image was a shadow of what it had been. His clients left him, his firm distanced itself, and Vanessa quietly resigned from her practice. Elena, on the other hand, emerged stronger. She started a new chapter, free of the lies and pretense that had suffocated her for so long. And though the memory of that fateful gala lingered, it no longer haunted her. It was simply the night she chose to reclaim her life. Months passed, but the aftershocks of the gala revelation continued to ripple through Daniel and Elena's lives. Daniel, once the golden boy of corporate law, now sat in his nearly empty office, staring at a stack of case files no one cared about. His largest clients had withdrawn their accounts, citing ethical concerns. The whispers behind his back, the judgment in his colleagues' eyes, it all wore on him. He was no longer the man people wanted to associate with. He was a cautionary tale. The affair with Vanessa had cost him everything. Her resignation from the clinic had been quiet, but she hadn't escaped unscathed. Rumors followed her to every job interview, every professional network event. The once promising doctor had been reduced to a pariah, and she had no one to blame but herself. She'd cut off contact with Daniel, their relationship crumbling under the weight of their shared disgrace. Meanwhile, Elena was thriving in a way she hadn't anticipated. The divorce had been swift, her lawyer ensuring she walked away with her fair share of Daniel's assets. It wasn't just about the money, though. She found herself again, her identity no longer tied to being Daniel's wife. She moved into a beautiful townhouse in the heart of the city, a place that reflected her newfound independence. She returned to her love of painting, filling her walls with vibrant canvases that felt like a reclamation of her creativity. And with encouragement from friends, she began working with a women's organization, advocating for those trapped in toxic relationships. One evening, Elena hosted her own gathering, a modest but elegant dinner party at her new home. Among the guests were friends who had stood by her side, colleagues from the nonprofit, and even a few women who had reached out to her after hearing her story. The atmosphere was warm, filled with genuine laughter and connection, a stark contrast to the superficial glamour of Daniel's galas. As the evening wound down, one of her friends raised a glass. "To Elena," she said with a smile, "for showing us all that grace and strength can rise from even the most difficult moments." The toast was met with applause, and Elena, though unaccustomed to being the center of attention for the right reasons, smiled warmly. For the first time in years, she felt at peace. Elsewhere, Daniel sat alone in a dimly lit bar, nursing a drink and scrolling through social media. He saw photos from Elena's dinner party, her radiant smile standing out among her guests. For a moment, he felt a pang of something he couldn't quite identify: regret, jealousy, or perhaps a bittersweet longing for the life he'd destroyed. But the feeling passed quickly. He flagged down the bartender for another drink, choosing to drown his thoughts rather than face them. The world had moved on without him, and deep down, he knew he had no one to blame but himself. As Elena cleaned up the last of the dishes that night, she paused by a window overlooking the city skyline. The past was still there, a faint shadow on the edge of her memory, but it no longer defined her. Her life was hers now, unburdened and full of possibility. And that, she thought, was the ultimate revenge. Time softened the sharp edges of the scandal, but it left Daniel and Elena on entirely different paths. For Daniel, the fallout became a slow descent into irrelevance. The firm that once held him as its star quietly pushed him out. His resignation was framed as mutual, though everyone knew the truth. His clients, once his lifeline, had dwindled to none. He tried to rebuild, opening a small consultancy, but the work was scarce, and so was the respect. His name no longer carried weight. It carried whispers. Vanessa disappeared completely. Word had it she'd moved to another state, starting fresh under a new name. Daniel hadn't spoken to her since the weeks following the gala, their last conversation filled with blame and bitterness. For all their supposed passion, there was nothing left between them but mutual ruin. For Elena, life blossomed in ways she hadn't imagined. Her involvement with the women's organization expanded into a leadership role. She became a sought-after speaker, sharing her story not as a victim, but as a survivor who had reclaimed her power. Her message resonated with many, and her poise turned her into a figure of quiet inspiration. One day, as she walked through a gallery where her paintings were being exhibited, she paused in front of a particularly vibrant piece. Swirls of emerald green and deep crimson, clashing yet harmonizing in a way that felt alive. A journalist approached her, pen and notebook in hand. "Miss Carter," the journalist began, then quickly corrected, "Apologies. Elena Hart. This piece, it's extraordinary. Does it represent a moment in your life?" Elena smiled, studying the canvas. "It represents freedom," she said simply. The article that followed painted her as a woman who had emerged from scandal, not as a casualty, but as a phoenix, rising from the ashes of betrayal. The publicity only bolstered her growing influence. One evening, months later, Daniel found himself walking aimlessly through the city. His attempts to rebuild his career had stalled, and his personal life was non-existent. He passed a bookstore window and froze. There, displayed prominently, was a book titled Asterisk Shattered, Then Whole, Reclaiming Myself After Betrayal Asterisk. The author's name, Elena Hart, glimmered in bold letters. He hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. Flipping through the pages, he found a chapter detailing the gala night, written with Elena's characteristic grace, but unflinching honesty. She didn't embellish, didn't vilify him more than necessary. She simply told the truth. The clerk recognized him, though he pretended not to notice the man's lingering gaze. Feeling exposed, Daniel quickly purchased the book and left. At home, he read it in one sitting. By the time he closed the back cover, a heavy silence settled over him. It wasn't the details that stung. It was the realization of how small he had become. Elena had taken the pieces he had shattered and built something extraordinary, while he had only sunk deeper into his own wreckage. For Elena, the book's release was the beginning of a new chapter. It became a bestseller, its royalties funding scholarships for women seeking to rebuild their lives. The public's fascination with her story faded over time, but her impact remained. She had found her voice, her purpose, and, most importantly, herself. On a crisp autumn evening, she stood on the balcony of her townhouse, a glass of wine in hand, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. There was no bitterness, no lingering anger, only peace. The life she had now wasn't the one she'd planned, but it was hers, and that made it perfect. Daniel, in his modest apartment across the city, nursed a drink as he scrolled through the reviews of her book. One line in particular stayed with him. Freedom isn't just leaving behind what broke you. It's discovering what you're capable of becoming. He set the glass down and stared out the window, the lights of the city blurring in his vision. He couldn't undo the past, but for the first time, he wondered if he still had a chance to salvage something of himself. Not for anyone else, but for him. And so, their stories diverged completely, one of triumph and rebirth, the other of quiet reflection and regret. The night of the gala had marked the end of one life for Elena and the beginning of another. For Daniel, it was a scar he'd carry forever. As the years unfolded, the distance between Elena and Daniel's lives grew immeasurable. Elena's world thrived in ways she had never anticipated. Her book led to invitations to speak at international conferences, where she shared her story of resilience and self-discovery. Women from all walks of life reached out to her, inspired by her ability to transform pain into power. She eventually expanded her advocacy work, founding a nonprofit dedicated to helping women navigate life after betrayal and upheaval. The organization, aptly named Whole Again *, provided legal support, counseling, and career workshops. Elena poured her heart into it, and its success became her legacy, a tangible proof of what strength could achieve. One evening, Elena attended a fundraiser for Whole Again *. The event was elegant but understated, a reflection of her style. She stood among a group of attendees, sharing stories of the lives her organization had touched. Her laughter was warm, her presence magnetic. A man approached her, a journalist she had met during her book tour. "I hear congratulations are in order," he said with a smile. Elena raised an eyebrow. "Oh? For what?" He gestured toward the stage where the evening's host was preparing to announce a major donation. "Word is, someone just pledged 7 figures to Whole Again *. Sounds like they were deeply moved by your story." Elena smiled but said nothing, waiting for the announcement. The host took the microphone, and the room quieted. "We are thrilled to announce an incredible gift to Whole Again *, made anonymously by someone who believes deeply in its mission. Their generosity will help countless women find their strength and independence." The room broke into applause, but Elena's mind lingered on the word anonymous *. Something about it stirred a faint, inexplicable feeling. Across town, Daniel sat in the quiet of his now humble apartment. His consultancy work had picked up slightly, but he had come to terms with the fact that his days of grandeur were gone. Over the years, he'd begun to reflect more deeply on the choices that had led to his downfall. It was during one of those moments of reflection that he stumbled upon whole again asterisk. He'd been scrolling aimlessly online when an article about the organization appeared, detailing its impact. He hadn't reached out, not directly, but something compelled him to contribute. Writing the check had been a strange experience. It wasn't about redemption. He knew that ship had sailed. It was about acknowledgement of the strength Elena had found and the ways he'd failed to see it. He didn't want recognition. He didn't even need her to know it was him. For the first time in years, Daniel felt the faint stirrings of peace, knowing he'd done something that mattered. Elena never learned the identity of the donor, though she occasionally wondered. Life had taught her that not all questions needed answers. She focused instead on what she could control: her work, her art, and the quiet joy she'd found in living a life free of pretense. On the anniversary of the gala that had changed everything, she attended a small dinner with close friends, raising a glass to how far she'd come. Somewhere, Daniel sat in his apartment, a faded photograph of the two of them on his desk, untouched but not forgotten. Their lives had diverged completely, yet each had found a path to something resembling peace. For Elena, it was a life well lived, full of purpose and connection. For Daniel, it was the slow, quiet work of accepting his failures and finding moments of grace where he could. The scars of the past remained for both of them, but they no longer defined their stories. In the end, they had moved on, not together, but forward in their own ways. Years later, the echoes of that fateful gala night had faded into the past, but its consequences shaped the lives of both Elena and Daniel in profound and lasting ways. Elena's nonprofit, whole again asterisk, had grown into an international organization, changing lives far beyond what she had imagined. She often traveled, speaking to women who had been through similar journeys, offering hope where once there had been despair. One day, while hosting a workshop in a small seaside town, Elena found herself drawn to the quiet of the nearby cliffs. The wind carried the scent of salt and the rhythmic crash of waves below. She sat there for hours, reflecting on the strange twists and turns that had brought her to this moment. As she sketched the coastline in her notebook, her phone buzzed with a call. It was her assistant. "Elena," the voice came, tinged with urgency. "You'll want to read this article. I'm sending it now." Moments later, a link appeared on her screen. The headline made her pause. Disgraced lawyer Daniel Carter opens free legal aid clinic in underserved communities. Asterisk asterisk. She tapped the article. Her curiosity piqued. The piece detailed Daniel's efforts to rebuild his life, not through power or prestige, but by helping those who couldn't afford legal representation. It was a small, underfunded operation, but it had already made a significant impact in the community. The article quoted him, "I've spent my life chasing success at the cost of others. Now, I want to do something that matters." Elena stared at the words for a long time. She felt no pang of anger, no bitterness, just a faint flicker of something like relief. Perhaps Daniel had finally found a way to make peace with himself. Months passed before their paths crossed again. It was unplanned, in a cafe tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. Elena was meeting a friend when she spotted him at a table near the window. Daniel looked older, his once carefully styled hair now flecked with gray, but there was a calmness about him that hadn't been there before. For a moment, she considered walking away, leaving him to his solitude, but something compelled her to approach. "Daniel," she said softly. He looked up, startled, then smiled faintly. "Elena, I didn't expect to see you. They exchanged pleasantries, the conversation tentative but civil. He asked about whole again, and she spoke with pride about its success. He shared details about his legal clinic, admitting humbly that it was a small operation, but one that brought him a sense of purpose. Good for you, Elena said, her tone sincere. It sounds like you've found something meaningful. He nodded. It took losing everything to realize what really mattered. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Finally, Daniel broke it. Elena, I know I can't undo what I did, but I want you to know I'm sorry. Truly. She studied him, searching for any trace of the man who had once been consumed by ego and ambition. What she saw instead was someone humbled, perhaps even redeemed in his own way. I forgave you a long time ago, Daniel, she said gently. Not for you, but for me. Carrying that anger, it wasn't worth it. He nodded, his expression one of quiet gratitude. They spoke for a few more minutes before parting ways, each walking out into the city's bustle, their lives still separate, but now touched by a strange sense of closure. As Elena returned to her townhouse that evening, she felt an unexpected lightness. The chapter with Daniel was truly closed, not with bitterness or regret, but with understanding. For Daniel, the encounter marked a moment of clarity. He knew his mistakes would always define parts of his story, but they no longer defined him. He had found a way to move forward, even if the path had been harder than he ever imagined. Their lives, once intertwined in turmoil, had taken different roads, yet both roads had led to something they had once thought impossible: peace. Years turned into decades, and the once scandalous saga of Daniel Carter and Elena Hart became a faint memory, remembered only by those who had been closest to it. Time, as it often does, softened the sharp edges of their history, leaving behind only the lasting impact of the choices they had made. Elena, now in her late 60s, stood in the expansive gallery of a museum hosting a retrospective of her art. Her hair, silver and luminous, framed a face etched with lines of experience and serenity. Guests milled about, admiring the vibrant canvases that told the story of her life, each brushstroke a testament to her resilience, each color a memory transformed into something beautiful. One piece, a massive painting of swirling emerald greens and deep blues, drew a small crowd. Beneath it, a plaque read, "Reclamation, dedicated to those who find strength in loss." It was one of her most famous works and the centerpiece of the collection. As Elena watched people admire it, she felt a quiet pride. Art had been her sanctuary, her voice, and her way of turning pain into meaning. At the edge of the gallery, a familiar figure lingered. Daniel, now in his 70s, watched from a respectful distance, his posture stooped but his gaze steady. He wore a simple suit, far removed from the tailored elegance of his younger days. His face bore the marks of time and humility, a man weathered but not broken. When their eyes met, Elena smiled faintly and gestured for him to come closer. He hesitated for a moment, then approached, moving slowly but deliberately. "You've come a long way," he said, his voice softer than she remembered. "So have you," Elena replied, her tone warm but reserved. She gestured toward the painting. "What do you think?" Daniel studied it for a moment, his eyes tracing the intricate layers of color. "It's honest," he said finally. "It feels like it's about letting go, but also holding on to what matters." Elena nodded. "That's exactly what it's about." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of years settling between them. Finally, Daniel spoke again, his voice tinged with reflection. "You've built something incredible, Elena. Your art, your life, the people you've helped. It's remarkable." She smiled gently. "And you? I hear your clinic is thriving." He chuckled softly. "Thriving might be a stretch, but we're helping people. That's enough for me." Their conversation meandered, touching on their work, their families. Elena had 2 grown children from a later marriage, while Daniel remained unmarried, dedicating his life to his practice. Though their paths had diverged long ago, the shared history between them created an unspoken bond, one that didn't require dwelling on the past. As the evening drew to a close, Daniel prepared to leave. He extended a hand, but Elena surprised him by pulling him into a brief, warm embrace. "Take care of yourself, Daniel," she said softly. "You too, Elena," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. He left quietly, blending into the crowd, while Elena returned to her guests. She stood beside her painting, watching as the gallery lights cast a golden glow over the vibrant canvas. Life had been unpredictable, messy, and often painful, but it had also been beautiful, just like her art. For both Elena and Daniel, the journey had been long and difficult, but they had found peace, each in their own way. Their lives were proof that even from the deepest fractures, something whole could emerge. As the years waned, the stories of Elena Hart and Daniel Carter finally reached their quiet conclusions. Their lives, once tangled in scandal and pain, had evolved into separate journeys, marked by resilience, growth, and a measure of peace. Elena spent her final years surrounded by love, family, and the enduring legacy of her work. Her nonprofit, *Whole Again*, continued to thrive, with chapters across the globe. Her children, now grown, carried her wisdom forward in their own lives. Elena often found herself reflecting on how far she had come, from the shadow of betrayal to a life filled with purpose and joy. One summer evening, as the sun set over her coastal retreat, she sat on her porch overlooking the waves, a canvas and paintbrush in hand. She worked slowly, savoring the act of creation. Her strokes were deliberate but light, capturing the ever-changing hues of the sky. It would be her last painting, though she didn't know it at the time, a masterpiece of tranquility and light, titled simply *Closure*. When she passed quietly in her sleep a few months later, her family found her surrounded by her art, her life a testament to the strength she had cultivated. The world mourned her loss, but celebrated her extraordinary legacy. Daniel's path had been quieter, but no less meaningful. He continued his work at the legal aid clinic until his health no longer allowed it. By then, he had helped countless people navigate challenges they couldn't face alone. Though he lived modestly, the gratitude of those he had served gave him a sense of purpose that no wealth or status ever could. In his final days, Daniel often thought of Elena, not with regret, but with a profound respect for the life she had built and the strength she had shown. One evening, sitting in his small apartment, he found a newspaper clipping about her final gallery exhibit, tucked into a book he had been reading. He stared at the image of her painting, *Reclamation*, and felt a bittersweet pang of admiration. She had turned the pain he had caused into something so beautiful, so lasting. When Daniel passed, quietly and alone, the news reached only a few who had known him in his later years. Among his sparse belongings was a letter addressed to *Whole Again*, with a simple note inside. "Your work changes lives. Keep going. D." The donation enclosed was modest compared to his earlier anonymous gift, but its meaning carried far more weight. In the end, their stories became part of something greater. Elena's art and advocacy touched the lives of countless people, inspiring them to rise above their circumstances. Daniel's quiet redemption showed that even the most flawed individuals could find ways to give back and make amends. Their lives were two sides of the same coin, one marked by resilience and triumph, the other by humility and atonement. Though their paths had long since diverged, the lessons they left behind intertwined, reminding the world that no matter how fractured the past, something whole could always be built from it. And so, their chapters closed, not in the blaze of scandal that once defined them, but in the quiet, enduring light of lives lived with purpose.